In this video, I'm going to go over how to export your artboards and import them into a new document. So here I have this set up with 6 different artboards. All of them have a background you can work with, and they are currently in trim view. So view, trim view, and you can see that there's extra stuff going off the edge. And this is just a little bit easier to see what my export will look like. So I can go to File, Export, and if I just want to export as PNGs or JPEGs, I can go to Export As, and I can choose Artboard Example, it's my file name, and go to PNG. And I want to make sure Use Artboards is checked, and let's call this example B. If I want to just arrange, I could choose the ones that I wanted to export, but make sure Use Artboards is checked, otherwise it'll get all of the detritus on the outside. And I do export, and since there is a background, you could ignore this background color. If you didn't have pixels there, you would see that it would be transparent. So I'm going to say OK. And then I can look at my files and see that those were indeed exported. Now, if I wanted to have these exported as PDFs or Illustrator files, PDFs being Illustrator files, having that vector data be embedded in there, what I would do is go to File, Export, and Export for Screens. And this is going to be a different type of interface where you can still choose all your artboards, or choose a range, choose your folder that you want them to go to. So I'm going to choose this exported folder, select folder, and then you want to make sure that PDF is chosen. And that's your format here. But one quick note is you want to choose this advanced settings and make sure that the setting for PDF is set to Illustrator default. I think by default, it sometimes has smallest file size. So you'll see like some jaggedness or just it won't be as high quality. So make sure Illustrator default is checked, save settings, and then export artboards. And you'll see that those have now been exported to this folder. I now have this other document that is just a blank sort of document set up, and I'm going to import those files. And you can do that a couple ways. The first one is just dragging and dropping directly under your document. And you'll see that all of those are now brought in, and I'm going to shrink them down a little bit and space them out. So they're all going to be on top of each other like this. And you can see that when you have the smart guides turned on, it'll actually work pretty well to be able to see the spacing, but I would do a couple things. There's 2 ways you can do this, or there's like 3 or 4 ways. But I could select all my images here, go to my align menu and make sure they're aligned horizontally along the vertical point in the middle, and then go to the distribute item. So now that one's set. So I would do, once those are set, I can do Control or Command G or right click and go to group. So those are all going to be grouped together. And then I can line up these ones underneath. And that is lined up in the center. These are already sort of lined up. Select all of these, make sure they're aligned in the center. And also, I can also go to the align menu here. Those are lined up. Command G or Control G. Select everything, Control G again. So these are all grouped, right? And then shrink them down. And then I can use my align menu to place them in the center of my board. So I can do that using align to artboard and make sure they are centered in the center of my screen. But another way to do this is by using the actual grid. So I'm going to Command Z a lot of this, and I'm going to zoom out and slide all my boards off the screen for a second. To see the grid, you go to View, Show Grid. Or on the side over here, if you're in Essentials Classic, you can turn it off and on. To get the spacing that you want on this grid, you want to look at a couple things. The first step is go to Edit, Preferences, and Grids and Guides and Grid. And here you can choose how far apart you want your main lines to be. So you can see my main lines are 50 pixels apart, and there's subdivisions of 10. So it'll be it'll be 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. And that makes it a little bit easier to see and easier to organize. I think working in 5s and 10s is helpful. So I'm going to come back, say okay, and then I need to look at what these are. So these ones are set currently to 430. So I might change all of these to 300, just so I know that I'm working in sets of 10s, and so it's divisible by 10 or divisible by 50. The reason both sides are changing is the pixel here is snapped on the side, or the icon for scaling proportionally. So I'm just going to go through and do this. Cool. And now I'm going to snap these to my grid, but notice that it's not snapping to specific points on the grid. And that's because if I click off, you'll see on the side here, I can have snap to grid on my snap options, or go to view and snap to grid. And by default, I usually have this turned off. I prefer to work with snap to pixel and snap to point, but if I am organizing my elements, this can be a little bit easier. So here, I'm going to snap to it right there, leave that 50 pixel space. And I'm going to shrink these down afterwards, but for right now, there we go, zoom out. And I'm just going to get these on my board to begin with, so that way I can actually see them. So let's zoom in. And they are snapping. You'll feel them snap as you are working with it. There we go. And now select everything, Command G. And this is where I would then make sure Artboard is turned on, snap to the middle, snap to the middle. And now those are perfectly centered on your artboard with equal space between each side. So you've got a couple different ways of doing it. The one other way you can import an image is File and Place. And when you do this, it's going to ask you, how do you want to import your image? So the other way to import your image is you go to File and Place. And the reason you want to do this is in case you have transparent pixels inside your document. So for example, if I make sure that Show Import Options is checked, and I click here, it's going to show me, do I want this to snap to the media, to the art itself? So for example, this image does not have that black background. It just has transparent pixels behind. And so this is going to crop to the art, and notice that that black line here is snapping to the outside of this triangle. If I choose media, it'll snap to the entire box. So if you do have transparent pixels, this is something to think about when you are importing or exporting media. But if you do have something like a black square behind it, or everything's cropped using a clipping mask around all of your objects, then you don't have to worry about this so much. But this is something you could encounter. And you'll see that that is set to only just have to account for that space since we chose media. I'm going to delete this. And lastly, since these are imported PDFs, if I double click into them, notice that this is a linked file. If I choose embed, now if I double click into it, I can still manipulate these objects. So you'll see from here, you can go in and edit these elements. And if you press escape to get out of isolation mode, you'll see that there's clipping groups inside here, and you have to release them if you want to get the other part of the triangle out. But you do have the ability using isolation mode to double click in and change any of these elements since they were brought in as PDFs.